Hi, Angie.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm hanging in there. How about you?
I'm doing exactly the same way. What a coincidence. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Angie Maxwell. You're a political scientist at the University of Arkansas. Is that correct so far?
That's right.
And you're also the author or co-author of a new book called The Long Southern Strategy, How Chasing White Voters in the South Changed American Politics. We should maybe add it was the Republicans who were doing the chasing. You and your co-author is Todd Shields, who's also, I gather, at the University of Arkansas.
He is. He is our Dean of Arts and Sciences.
Oh, so we should speak only nicely about him then.
We absolutely should.
Okay.
No, there is nothing bad to say.
Okay.
Good guy.
Okay. So, really interesting book published by Oxford University Press. Been out a couple of months. Seems to be getting a lot of attention. And I guess, tell me if this is the wrong way to say it. It is your account, not shared by everyone or all academics, but it's your account of how the Republican Party came to have essentially its present demographic composition and its present ideological composition to a large extent. And by virtue of that, I mean, it's relevant to the Trump presidency because the Republican constituency is something he kind of inherited. It's an interesting question, and we can talk about this, how he might have tried to change it, how he may have changed it. But because he wasn't exactly a classic Republican, 5 years ago. So it's very relevant to the present moment. And I'm really looking forward to asking you about it. Why don't you start off by telling us what just the Southern strategy is? I mean, the difference between your thesis and a more long-standing and conventional account of Republican politics is that modifier long. You're talking about the long Southern strategy. People have long talked about the Southern strategy. Tell us what they meant by that.
Well, the common kind of understanding of the Southern strategy is that after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that there was so much angst in the South among white segregationists that the Republican Party, that was very divided on this, but its nominee who wins out, Barry Goldwater, decides to kind of play up the fact that he voted against the Civil Rights Act and see if he can crack this kind of solid South that had been voting Democratic for so long. And there have been a few cracks in the 50s and in the 40s. And so let's put our efforts there in an electoral map strategy. And then Goldwater, particularly as surrogates like Strom Thurmond, who's a Democratic senator that flips and becomes Republican in 1964, changes his party ID. Mm-hmm. They are successful in winning 5 Deep South states, including 87% of the vote in Mississippi, which is an insane flip.
That's a lot.
But they lose the rest of the country other than Arizona. So Nixon tweaks that a little bit in 68. Again, the Republican Party is in a huge fight over, will they pursue this strategy or not? Kind of the Rockefeller wing of the Republican Party is adamantly against it, right? So it's by no means this, unanimous consent of all Republicans. It's a real departure for Republicans at that point, who had a very, pro-civil rights platform, or at least a moderate civil rights platform, all through the 1950s and early 60s. So they support Nixon in the 68 convention, and Nixon, since George Wallace, the Alabama segregationist governor, jumps in the race as a third party candidate. Nixon tweaks his kind of appeal with that coded language, and therefore the South turns Republican. That is the traditional, Southern strategy story. They played to the kind of racial appeal and made it palatable for enough Southerners to flip it.
Okay. And, a lot of our viewers and listeners may not they kind of probably just take it for granted the South is Republican. But,
right.
It's funny. One of my earliest political memory is of the Kennedy-Nixon presidential campaign. Just barely remember who the good guy was and who the bad guy was. And my family, both my parents came from West Texas farm families.
Oh, wow.
And actually, there's a little Arkansas in our lineage, too. But anyway, they were not, and my father was a career Army officer. So they were not the kinds of people, looking at it today, you would assume they vote Republican. But what I remember is Kennedy was a good guy, Nixon was a bad guy. And essentially that was because we were from Texas, I think, right? I mean, and that's
everything was Democrat. I mean, it was Democrat. I mean, Republican was the party of Lincoln. It was the party of the Union. I mean, it is solidly Democrat after Reconstruction all the way until what happens is that the National Democratic Party at the national level starts to move in a progressive direction.
Right.
FDR, a little bit, then Harry Truman particularly. And Southern segregationists, they break off in 1948 and run their Dixiecrat third party ticket with Strom Thurmond as their presidential nominee, thinking that the Democrats will lose. Truman will lose re-election, and then the National Democratic Party will have to bring them back into the fold, right? They'll because they can't win without him. And of course, Truman ekes it out. And so these pretty staunch segregationists are kind of caught in this purgatory for several election cycles where they're kind of trying to make amends with the National Democrats and hold on, but then the Republicans haven't really pursued them yet. And so when they do, some of them flip. And then it snowballs. Mm-hmm. But the story we tell is that it's just, Goldwater, Nixon, and then boom, the South goes red.
And it's
a lot longer story than that.
Right. And it continues for a lot longer. In your account, there are other factors that get added on to the other things that get added on to the strategy. And here we are. But to dwell on this moment in history a little bit, the 60s, so an absolute threshold, I think you'd agree, is the Civil Rights Act.
Absolutely.
And I have, and I promise that after this, I'll quit reminiscing about my childhood. But another memory I have is in 1964, the summer of 64, must have been a month after the Civil Rights Act was passed. We were moving from Virginia to El Paso, Texas. My father's in the Army. We moved a lot. And I remember stopping at a service station in the Deep South, and you'd ask to go to the bathroom, and the guy would say, "Well, go here," and he'd give you the keys. And what the thing would say is, it wouldn't say bathroom; it would say like employees only or something like that. And my father explained to me after we left that what they were doing was, for a month now or whatever, for weeks now, it had been illegal to have segregated bathrooms. And my father explained what they're doing is they're looking at you. And if you're white, they give you the keys to one, bathroom that doesn't say bathroom on it, but is a bathroom. And if you're black, they give you another one. Now, the Civil Rights Act, I think it also raises the question of how strategic the strategy had to be to work. In other words, as you know, you can probably recite the quote from memory. But Lyndon Johnson famously said, he became president with the assassination of Kennedy in late '63, used the political momentum kind of flowing from the assassination to get a lot of things done. He got the Civil Rights Act passed. He said something like, is said to have said, with the Civil Rights Act, the Democratic Party has lost the South for a generation, right? Mm-hmm. So one question is, did this really take a lot of orchestration on the part of Republicans, or was it just bound to happen once the Democrats were identified with the Civil Rights Act by virtue of having been the party that passed it?
This is a great question. It depends on if we believe fundamentally that the civil rights issue had to be a partisan, polarizing issue. Because in the 1950s, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party's platforms on civil rights almost completely match. So we could have, for example, debated, fought over how we go about implementing, federal help to kind of ease the racial gap or to dismantle structural racism. It didn't have to become one party here, one party over here. Phyllis Schlafly, who comes up later with the anti-equal rights amendment movement, she writes a book in 1964 that she self-publishes called A Choice, Not an Echo. And she criticizes the Republican Party for nominating what she calls like Democratic light, candidates.
So the idea was that the Republican Party was a mere echo of the Democratic Party?
Yep. And we can't tell the difference. And if people can't tell the difference between the two parties, if you don't go stand on the opposite side, we're going to just lose election after election after election. Goldwater, it sells millions of copies. Goldwater adopts it as one of his slogans during his 1964 campaign, a choice, not an echo, his buttons, his signs. And so even though Goldwater, claimed to have voted against the Civil Rights Act because of some issues he had with, can the federal government legislate, social change, morality, kind of this theoretical, abstract, opposition. Mm-hmm. It was an opportunity that a lot of his surrogates undertook, and Goldwater went along with it in his big campaign run through the South, which was called Operation Dixie. But it's also really important to remember that the thing they know that's coming, the Civil Rights Act, very threatening, but what's coming is voting rights. And that is what is also galvanizing that support, because once African Americans can vote in the South, without all of the state obstructions, that's when they're really concerned that white Southerners are really concerned that political power is going to shift. Okay.
So that's so you're seeing it as pretty conscious on the part of the politicians who did orchestrate it, a very strategic thing that in your view didn't necessarily have to. You're saying civil rights didn't have to be a wedge issue, basically.
It didn't have to be a wedge issue. They chose to. It wasn't. It's a bipartisan. The Civil Rights Act passes with bipartisanship. Mm-hmm. Johnson says that because Johnson's the one signing it, right?
Did most Republicans in Congress vote for the Civil Rights Act?
Lots of them did. Mm-hmm.
Lots of them, but not a majority.
I would have to look it up to make sure, but it is overwhelming. It is. Because if you think about it, Johnson, who's the Democratic Party base at that time? Overwhelmingly it's Southerners, right? White Southerners leading into 64. They're not voting for it. It's Johnson working with Republicans and then non-Southern Democrats that is actually having success getting that through, right? And it's a real fight. I'm telling you, there was an entire wing of the Republican Party that was so upset about Goldwater's decision to kind of go that route. Nixon in 1960, the campaign, you remember, if you go look at Nixon's campaign commercials from 1960, he runs a completely pro-civil rights campaign. Praises Earl Warren, praises Brown v. Board. It's amazing. So that is not where they were as a party. And the leadership goes first, definitely in a strategic, let's see how this goes kind of, we've got to break up this block in the South. We have an opportunity, that's what strategists do after they've lost election cycles. Is that let's rethink the board. Let's look at let's map out a new plan. And it was not what was coming from the people of the party.
Mm-hmm. So that remains part of the Republican strategy. Nixon uses language like law and order that was taken to tap into white fears of black crime. Mm-hmm. Reagan has an important kind of political event early on in some kind of some site that had been in the South that had been the site of a civil mm-hmm. rights related crime, and that was taken to be a dog whistle and so on.
Well, it's more than that too. It's more than that with Reagan and Nixon. One of the things Nixon does is he says he will have benign neglect. That's what it's called on civil rights enforcement. He basically says, kind of, federal government won't send the military to Little Rock Central Like, we won't go that route.
As Eisenhower himself had, a Republican.
Right. And then, which Nixon was his VP, right? And so then that like hands off to a lot of white Southerners translated to no enforcement, great. Then that is kind of state control, right? Mm-hmm. And Reagan, he hit up states' rights at that Neosho County Fair in Mississippi.
Right.
And then he also, which by the way, you know, who organized Ronald Reagan's Southern campaign in 1980 was Paul Manafort. That's who ran it, right? So there are some of the same consultants throughout all of these cycles too, which is important. But the other thing Reagan did that kind of extends this Southern strategy on the racial component is he really starts pushing colorblindness, which as an abstract concept is, you know, wonderful, right? But what it meant then is let's move past race. Let's halt our federal spending on these programs. Let's all move past race. We're not going to see any of these, you know, racial differences or hierarchy, which is a sentiment that a lot of people want to embrace and would not pick up as a dog whistle. But at the same time that you're pushing the welfare queen, you know, image and really hitting on everything's a fiscal conservatism when money's being spent on these kinds of programs and everything's a very zero-sum game, that also really works and kind of extends some of that racial kind of competition, that sense that we're all pitted against each other. Mm-hmm. And that was very deliberate and chosen.
Okay, so the traditional Southern strategy story emphasizes that one issue a lot, race.
Yeah.
And then what are you adding to the story? What do you mean when you talk about the long Southern strategy?
Well, I mean, first, that it's important to remember that the South flips right back to Jimmy Carter in 1976.
Right.
So we kind of stop the story, and then yet here comes the Democrats run a Southerner, and the South flips right back. So most of the time when something like that happens, I mean, you can imagine if that happened.
Can I interrupt you with one thing? Because this just occurred to me is
sure.
Carter is running against a guy, Gerald Ford, who probably didn't really pursue the Southern strategy.
He didn't. It's exactly right. The Republicans who lost through this period of time are the ones who didn't, right? The Gerald Fords, the John McCains, the Mitt Romneys, the Bob Doles that wouldn't push this, thing. So it is not universal. It's not all GOP. It's not all members. It's not been all candidates, which is a really important point. Also, the only time that the Democrats pull Southerners back is when they run a Southerner, right? Mm-hmm. Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton. But so the South flips back to blue. Now you can imagine that if that happened in 2020 or 2024, that like a whole group of states that went one way went back, people would not be then saying, oh, well, that was the end of the story. They go, what is happening? And the Republicans really do have a big time kind of powwow about, are they going to keep pursuing these Southerners? They're really worried that the inroads they made were washed away by Watergate. And how are they going to win these folks back? Mm-hmm. And so one of the things they notice during Carter's term is that we've kind of forgotten this issue, but the Equal Rights Amendment had so much bipartisan support when it passed Congress in 71 and 72.
That part I've definitely forgotten, I had definitely forgotten that it had bipartisan support, because you so think of it now as a partisan issue.
You do, totally. I mean, passed by 90% of the Senate and the House. I mean, it's almost unanimous. And then it passes, it needs it gets through 30 states, ratified in 30 states in 12 months. I mean, it just seems like it's a done deal, like it's on that path. And then all of a sudden, momentum stops, right? And there's all these setbacks. And it's because Phyllis Schlafly's Stop ERA organization, which stood for Stop Taking Our Privileges, really starts getting kind of a grassroots movement behind it.
And that
so sorry.
No, go ahead and finish. I have a question, but go ahead.
Okay, that culminates in a 1977 big anti-ERA rally in Houston under the slogan Family Values.
Right.
And the Republicans really take notice, and they decide in 1980 to drop the Equal Rights Amendment from their platform in order to win, the Phyllis Schlafly crowd, which happened to be a whole lot of Southern white women.
So this becomes another kind of wedge issue, feminism. Mm-hmm. I remember Rush Limbaugh, as he gained momentum, one of his favorite terms was feminazis.
Oh yeah.
Can you remind us what exactly was in the Equal Rights Amendment? And I mean, of course, the idea was to give equal rights to women. But what fears did Phyllis Schlafly play on, and others play on? I vaguely remember.
Sure.
And were any of them at least accurate? I think I remember saying, well, women will be compelled to go fight wars. That was one, right?
Mm-hmm. There was a debate about would there be an amendment that was going to exclude, the military draft, and there was debates about, well, if women are drafted, still there are fitness tests in the military and people are put where they're suited and different things like that. What happened is that, and I completely empathize with it, because what Schlafly said was not that feminism was going to be a choice, right? Not that it was just going to be clearing obstacles for whatever choices women wanted to make, but that it was going to mandate that women put their children in government daycare, that women serve on the front lines, that it would emasculate men, that women would be forced to work. And even though there were a whole lot of smart women who might have gone, really, it's going to make us do that? The fear, particularly in the South, where was no institutional support for those women to go do that.
When you say that again, there was no institutional.
There's no institutional support, and
for them to do what?
To be like a working mom, right?
See.
There's not a history of it. There's not a culture of it. They don't know opportunities of it, and it's a status thing, right? So it was like, who are the working women in the South? Poor women. Women of color, right? So for a whole lot of these middle class and upper class kind of Southern white women, working was only if you had to, right? And if you didn't have to financially, you wouldn't, and you shouldn't. And then it also has a very deep kind of religious component, that it was somehow going to, destabilize the family, and it was against God's will. I mean, all of that stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And so it hit but it's what it hits in so many of those Southern white women is just, she's painting a world they cannot imagine. So even if the idea of maybe working outside the home and doing something creative, or maybe they have something more they want to do, but there's just not paths that they can see. And so if all of a sudden somebody's saying it's required, it's terrifying. It's very, very upsetting. And hard to, it makes them get organized. They also felt, even though feminism was choice, most of the feminists that were profiled were women that were choosing to be involved in politics or the workplace, mm-hmm. right? Even though it was supposed to be choice. That's what it looks like. Right. And so it does become kind of pitting working women against stay-at-home moms, or modern women against traditional women. And it felt insulting, and so Phyllis Schlafly's hitting that too, threatening your way of life. In Georgia, for example, in the state of Georgia, it piggybacked on the anti-civil rights movement mm-hmm. issues. A lot of the anti-ERA, stop ERA slogans in the South were about, okay, so the government's going to come do this to you too. They use slogans like, don't desexagregate us, right? Piggybacking on desegregate. And here we go, more change, right? And it just made a lot of Southern white women feel compelled by Schlafly's message. It was a volatile time and compelled by that message, which I have deep empathy for. It's just that usually when we look at the morning after the 1980 election, the argument is always the economy, foreign policy. But if you look at the numbers, the percentage of women, Southern white women, over 66% supported the ERA before Schlafly's movement started. And then it drops to 40% or lower among some groups of Southern white women. And then they roll out for Reagan over Carter 2-1.
So there again, I mean, so there's a question kind of related to the question I asked you about to what extent was the strategy required? To what extent was this orchestrated? It's not exactly the same question, but it's to what extent were voters and people manipulated in your view? So in other words, clearly with the feminism thing, there was a pre-existing difference of viewpoint, in the aggregate on average, in the South compared to the North. And that was recognized by Republican strategists. But it sounds like you're also saying there was a certain amount of manipulation, at least in the sense of mischaracterizing what, in your view, the Equal Rights Amendment actually entailed.
And I would argue that on that case, Schlafly's the one who did that. But they saw that it worked. I mean, Reagan's team polled 40,000 American women. I mean, that's the other thing. The Republican Party was so ahead of the Democratic Party on its data analysis, and not on horse race polling, but on the deep psychological dive to figure out the electorate. They polled 40,000 American women. Elizabeth Dole helped him head it up. She was young. And they realized they divided women into 64 categories. They gave them each names like Nancy's, Betty's, Helen's. And they realized something that we still don't really do enough of is that, not all women are the same, and not all women have the same ideas about being a woman. And so they, based on that, right, they realize where they're targeting states to pick up on an electoral map strategy, there are more of the women who do not support the ERA anymore. And so they can drop it for their platform, create a big distinction between themselves and the Democratic Party, right? And somehow that's going to help dislodge these Democrats in the South that have, converted and then gone back, right? How do you really pull it out and kind of have them see themselves as Republicans, which was hard for a lot of long-standing Democrats to do, right? So it's not that it's manipulated, but it does get perpetuated. And I feel the same way about the racial component of the Southern strategy. They tapped into something very real. That decision didn't have to be polarized and partisan, but they tapped into something real, and then they made it partisan. And then in some cases, they exacerbated it, right? They overdrove. They didn't let it, evolve, soften, maybe weaken, pass by generations, that we hope will happen with things like racism and sexism. Continuing to kind of make that feel, to play that racial threat card, or, the feminists are going to, destroy the country. We see the rise of the men's rights organizations. We see that, the women are a threat to the family, working women are a threat to the family. We see all of that get played politically. It's not that the sentiment's not there, but it exacerbates it.
Now, notwithstanding any of these political tactics, views in these areas, race, gender, they do get more progressive over time in the South, right? In some kind of absolute sense. Well, you tell me. I mean, you've looked at the polling data.
They have morphed. So, the overt racism, that is, we would measure by saying, characteristics like, work ethic of African Americans, from like a scale that goes from hardworking to lazy, right? Trustworthy, intelligent, those kind of our old fashioned racism scale, been used a long time. You wouldn't, after the civil rights movement, you've got, there are fewer people saying those aggressive things.
And I mean, I haven't heard anybody say that you should be allowed to have segregated bathrooms at a service station lately, right? Whereas they were saying that in the 60s. They were saying this is an unwarranted federal intrusion on a private enterprise.
Absolutely true. I mean, in many ways, they have used white flight in some of the suburbs to recreate some of that in some communities in the South. But yes, you don't.
They did the whole religious school thing as a way around. Oh, yeah. Start your brand new religious school as it happens. Only white kids attend. There was that, and Mississippi's school system's so segregated now. It's hard to see a lot of change. So there was some recreation of white spaces, but you're right. Policy wise, you can't go out there and kind of make that argument. That's not going to fly. What we did see is something called racial resentment, which is a scale of questions that are just kind of denying that there's some kind of institutional racism, wanting to move past race, like it's been enough. African Americans have gotten enough. This series of questions have been measured since the late 70s. And those numbers are, just as the overt ones go down, these go up, right? And and now we're actually seeing post-Trump, we're seeing a surge back of the overt. Could be a backlash to Obama's election that's just now kind of trickling up. Could be Trump related. It's hard to tell that. The same thing happens with the sexism scales we use. This like attitudes towards women scale, which is the very traditional women belong, and it hurts the family when women work. Women belong in the home place. Women shouldn't be, kind of commander in chief. They can't be decisive. Things like that. Also, those numbers down. But what we have seen gone up is what's called modern sexism, which is just this distrust. It's not that we think women can't do the job. It's we distrust women who want to. So what is that about? What is that? Why is she wanting to run? I don't trust that. What's her game? What's her agenda? She just wants power, and a denial that there's still any kind of, gender gap in pay or sex and things like that. Right. And so we see that it's a step in the right direction, but one of the mistakes that was made in 2016 is thinking that, just because the attitudes towards women numbers were shrinking, that there wasn't something coming in its place. Nobody's asking these female candidates running this year, can you be commander in chief? They're not asking that anymore. Push through that. But what's this agenda? Do we believe her? Like this kind of distrust and, fear that's still there. And it comes from women, white women, just as much as men. So it's not a man versus woman thing. Yeah. In fact, I guess a big kind of prime mover of the gender part of the Republican Southern strategy, in your view, was the discovery through polling data, right? That that Southern women just were not nearly as feminist as Northern women.
Well, I mean, if you look at no one does this in the media and post-election analysis, which I understand. But, when we say that Hillary Clinton lost white women, she won white women outside the South. No one breaks it up that way. She lost white women in the South by 20 points.
Right.
It really is one of the places where there is a real, regional gap. And we've finally gotten better about at least disaggregating data on women by race, because it's extremely different on political data, but we haven't done that, by region. And it turns out, or even by, some kind of belief in women's equal or, modern roles, gender roles, something. But it's like two different entire, groups of people. They don't vote the same on anything. Their attitudes aren't the same on almost anything. You
mean Southern and Northern women?
Well, Southern white women who are kind of anti-feminist.
Southern white women, right.
And white women who are, feminists, for lack of a better word. And then the percentage of white women who are anti-feminist is just so much higher in the South.
Okay.
Right. And so it can actually, it's not that any of this doesn't exist outside the South. It does. It's just, it's not as concentrated. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't have voting power. It doesn't, it can't control majority.
Views on feminism is a strong predictor of views on other things.
It's like two Americas. Mm-hmm. It really is. And the problem though is how you measure it, because, you know, there's some early work that was on like, let's look at, you know, attitudes on feminism instead of looking at men versus women. Right? Because like feminist man, feminist woman have way more common politically on a host of issues than their anti-feminist counterparts, right? But the problem is the word got so demonized that it's a hard thing now to even get kind of women who, you know, would say they believe in equal rights won't call themselves a feminist. I mean, the word got really...
That's kind of what I was getting at when I said haven't views become more progressive in the South on race and gender. One of the things I'm getting at is that even if it's the case that Republicans have, as you argue, consistently tried to exploit both issues for a long time now, it's kind of a moving target for them, right?
It is a moving target. It's a moving target. And as demographics change in the South, it's one of the reasons in the book that we look at South versus non-South geographically, which of course is all, you know, pollsters and like, you know, in terms of elections, that's all that matters. But we also look at identifying as Southern and not identifying as Southern. Because there's a whole lot of people living in the South now that are, you know, new transplants. They might not adopt these attitudes. And there's a lot of people identifying as Southern that don't live in the South. Mm-hmm. And that's just to kind of show, you know, basically the Republican Party, when it decided to go try to break up that block, it didn't just go South. It kind of became Southern. It kind of adopted some of its, like the worst tenets of Southernism, so to speak, white Southernism, and some stylistic things. And it kind of nationalized that.
What are the stylistic things?
You know, a politics of entertainment. So when you have one party politics, which, you know, V.O. Key, who's kind of the, you know, godfather of the study of Southern politics, his big book in 1949, he calls it, you know, the droll facade. So you have one party politics. And so it doesn't become a contest of ideas. It becomes personality, right? Who's entertaining? It becomes tent revival like and big rallies and pageantry related to the politics of all of this. There is an us versus them style that is very absolute.
But he's saying this was the Democrats back when the South was Democratic. This was characteristic of Democratic politics in the South.
It was. And they were so used to it because they had to have a one-party system in order to not have real competition, in order to not have the debate about slavery and not have the debate about Jim Crow. So opposing opinions, opposing parties were, you know, squashed out, right? One-party politics control, but there are repercussions of that. And that is one of them, that it becomes this politics of entertainment, that you're either for us or you're against us. It becomes very absolutist in nature. There is early documentation of any kind of criticism of the South that was, you know, delivered in speeches in Congress and people who were worried about, you know, federal policies that weren't being implemented, with white Southerners saying that is, these newspapers are outrage mills, basically fake news, right? They're just lying about us, right? That culture attacking the media, us versus them, the rallies and kind of pageantry tent revival, like the politics of entertainment, politics of resentment, you know?
Yeah. Now
all of that style too.
Yeah. The politics of resentment, I would say, has been particularly prominent in the Trump era. And I remember, tell me how big a watershed this is, when Dan Quayle, who was vice president, George Bush's vice president, I think starts using the term cultural elite. He goes after Murphy Brown, which was a TV show she was a single woman who chose to be a mother, I guess, was it? And so it seemed to be kind of a celebration of single woman motherhood. And look, it's a totally fair issue of is it sometimes a mistake if you don't have the resources to whatever? But of course, Murphy Brown was upper middle class. It wasn't an issue. But in any event, I guess he was saying that's a dangerous signal to send. But there was a larger thing about these cultural elites who, I think the word used, maybe not by him, but other Republicans at the time, was they have contempt. I think Rich Bond, who was chairman of the GOP, said Democrats or something have contempt for the values of ordinary Americans, or these Eastern elites, just something like this, cultural elites, right? This is now a huge thing, it seems to me.
Huge.
And how do you trace the evolution of that?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, George Wallace called it positive polarization. So when you're trying to redefine who you are.
We should remind younger viewers, he's a 1968 independent presidential candidate, segregationist governor from the South, and he gets a bit non-trivial chunk of the vote. Right. So
and
anyway,
gets shot, gets attempted assassination.
And to some extent, Nixon was cutting into his, in 68, he was the big, Wallace naturally pulled probably Nixon toward a Southern strategy, right?
Well, Nixon knew that Wallace was going to get like the deep South states that Goldwater had gotten.
Mm-hmm.
And so Nixon's like, how do I get the rest? Well, I need to say it like that, but make it palatable for people who don't want to look like that, right? Mm-hmm. So he kind of is piggybacking off of Wallace. But Wallace called one of his strategies positive polarization. So when you rather not say what you stand for, you say what you're not. So this is Wallace going, I mean, if you want to be over there with those hippie agitators with your long hair and your, pencil head elite, he said those things.
Pencil neck geeks, we call them.
Pencil neck geeks. Thank you.
Speaking is one of them.
Yes, me too. So, and so he's not really saying what he is. He's saying what he's not. And that is a technique that gets really picked up by the Republican Party, right? And so there's Quayle going, if you want to, there's ordinary citizens us, and there's these people like Murphy Brown, right? Mm-hmm. And they are extreme, and we are the common, right? Now, this really works in places like the South, where the culture is very homogenous, right? Particularly rural America, where there isn't so much diversity of religious viewpoints and different types of schools and different types of, jobs, classes, all of that, because if what they're saying you agree with, like if that's your values and they're saying that's ordinary America, that feels right to you because the Murphy Brown feels extreme. You mm-hmm. don't have interaction with a lot of people like that. That's why, like the Supreme Court decision on gay marriage, that is shocks people in, the Bible Belt kind of part of the South, because they, it's what's the difference between an evangelical in Mississippi and one in Maine, right? Nothing theologically. It's just everyone else around them is an evangelical in Mississippi. So it creates this kind of sacred canopy that other ideas kind of don't penetrate. And so when something like that happens nationally, it does feel like it's extremist. It does feel like it must be by a fringe group. It doesn't feel real or true to what they know. Mm-hmm. And Republicans really kind of play to that.
Okay, so that's another thing. You mentioned religion, and that's another thing you're adding to this picture. It's a big part of your story. The long Southern strategy comes to rely on, bringing evangelicals into the Republican base, keeping them there. I think there's a statistic in your book about how the percentage of Southern Baptist ministers who identified as Republican goes from a pretty small minority to a large majority of Southern Baptist ministers in not not that much time. Now, it seems to me there is, there's some intersection between that and another issue you're emphasizing, feminism, which we've discussed. And part of that intersection, I guess you could say, is the issue of abortion, right?
Absolutely.
And here again, the question of how much strategizing was necessary comes up, because I remember I went to high school in San Antonio, and this is right around Roe versus Wade. And I remember two different teachers volunteering their views on abortion, which wasn't part of the curriculum.
Right.
One was a history teacher named Mr. Lightfoot, and another was a biology teacher. But they both just they were really not happy with that decision. So there was a lot of. And, San Antonio, it's not the least cosmopolitan part of Texas by a long stretch. This is
right.
suburban San Antonio. Now, Mr. Lightfoot was a farmer, basically, but the other guy was like not rural in origin. But there was heartfelt opposition to abortion in the religious South. So that was there, right?
Kind of.
Okay, so tell us what you think, how that was used.
Well, it's a great. Were there personal attitudes there? Sure. Was it a political issue? Not until after Roe v. Wade and the ERA, right? So it's kind of like there's something about the fact that the Supreme Court legalizes it, right? Even though people knew it was going on. But it's like, it feels like a government endorsement of it, right? In ways that really bother people, like they do about, gay marriage to a degree, right? So there's that. But it's also because the assertion by feminists and pushing a second wave feminists, pushing for reproductive rights, reproductive control, sexual harassment laws, all of those somewhat unspoken things that had not been in the political dialogue made a lot of people very uncomfortable. I mean, there was not statutes on the books about, like, if you were married, you could not be, there was no such thing as marital rape. There was no kind of, there wasn't a lot of domestic violence laws on the books, just all of it, right? And so it becomes portrayed, abortion does, as another form of birth control, right? Mm-hmm. These women just don't want to have kids, and so this is what they're doing.
And I think there's another thing, which is that it was thought to be part of the cultural of sexual promiscuity, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I remember Mr. Lightfoot. You know what Mr. Lightfoot, my history teacher, said about abortion? He said, the people who want abortion are people who want to have their fun and not pay for it.
Oh, my God.
And I mean, there's two reactions to that. One is, that's a pretty grim view of parenthood. It's the price you pay for having sex once, right? But even beyond that, I mean, I think it does. It just pretty clearly suggests that there was a larger connotation of abortion to these people, and it was a culture of permissiveness and promiscuity, right? And
they associated promiscuity with feminism. So the idea that these women were throwing off their traditional values then meant, what are they doing? They just must be out there, breaking all kinds, with all this sexual freedom, breaking all kinds of like social norms. And then when they get in trouble, they just get an abortion. It kind of all snowballs. But here's the thing that's really important that had to happen in order for that to really take off politically. In the South, the Southern Baptist Convention, which was the, largest, as the largest kind of loosely governing denominational organization in the South, goes from moderate to fundamentalist over a course of 10 years. So in 1979, two fundamentalist, leaders and ministers had hatched a plan to get a fundamentalist elected at the SBC. And then over 10 years, that fundamentalist president would appoint, there's a committee on committees, believe it or not, which sounds like my nightmare, committee on committees. They would appoint fundamentalists onto that. And then those fundamentalists would appoint more fundamental, and it would trickle down until they had a fundamentalist takeover of the organization. They wanted that because they felt like Baptists were being too accommodating to these social changes, right? That they were not outraged enough, right? And that they are something my guess is they felt powerless. There's something that they should do, right, in the face of these cultural changes. As if you can't, the cultural changes don't mean you can't regulate your own behavior, right? But prior to that, the Baptist Church, of course, it was all about sole competency, independence, no hierarchy. That is what it was. Personal relationship with God. And they did not subscribe to any kind of dictates from a hierarchical kind of governing coalition, right? That was the whole point. So when the fundamentalist takeover happens and they literally start purging moderate Baptists from the organization, you must believe this or you do not belong here, right? They reinstitute into their code the submissiveness of women. They kick all women out of seminary, out of the major Baptist seminaries that were in seminary. That happens in the early 1980s.
At what point does Jimmy Carter quit the Southern Baptist Convention in reaction to all this?
Oh, I'm trying to remember what year it is.
But it's kind of after this has congealed, right?
Yes, it's after that.
Okay.
It's after that. In fact, it's one of the reasons there were some, early kind of, Southern Baptists who thought, well, Jimmy Carter's kind of one of us, right? He's born again. They're quickly very disappointed, right? But the other thing, the most important thing that happens when the takeover happens, and I don't use that word lightly. The moderates that left the church during that period of time, they were traumatized by this and felt exiled truly. And anyway, that takeover is that they fired their lobbying, organization, which had been in DC for a long time, basically watching legislation to protect, freedom of exercise. Like, let's just make sure Baptists are able to practice their beliefs. That was it. They were very much on defense, not offense. And they replace it with a lobbying association that will push for establishment, right? They want prayer back in school. They want an assertion of Christian values, and they want prayer breakfasts. They want all of that. They want a faith-based, federally funded faith-based initiatives. They want the tax breaks, all of those things. And that's a real shift. And the Republican Party is so torn over what to do with this group because they bail on Carter. And so Reagan needs them. Reagan pays lip service to a lot of it, but they get a little disillusioned with Reagan. They feel a little bit like he doesn't do enough of what they want him to do. There's not enough action. He'll speak the language. He goes to the Southern Baptist Convention and says, you may not endorse me, but I endorse you. The famous line, I'm with you. Right. So in 1988, Pat Robertson runs in the primaries, like one of their own. Well, he doesn't.
For very young viewers, he's, he I guess he ran the Christian broadcasting thing and a very interesting figure, had various weird things about him. But go ahead, that's enough.
Christian Wright, which the SBC becomes a big piece of, but it's a larger kind of Christian Wright. He runs and, he can't get enough support. And so they realize okay, it's not going to be one of our own. We're going to have to influence through the party, but we're going to be tougher. We don't want to be a bridesmaid. We want to be the bride. Like, this is going to be a marriage. HW is uncomfortable with it. He is. They've been using the
the first George Bush.
Yeah. uncomfortable with it, but
I mean, he's a good example of somebody who by nature would not have fit with the Southern strategy, right? He comes from a mainline church, probably certainly Episcopalian, right? Northeast, moderate. His father's presumably a Rockefeller Republican, right? His father's in the Senate. You're kind of not so much, you're saying, the Rockefeller Republican, his father?
I mean, George H.W. Bush said that he would have voted against the Civil Rights Act. He wasn't in Congress yet. He was running, but he loses.
Him or his father? His father, Prescott, I was saying, would have.
I'm sorry.
I was just saying Prescott would have been a Rockefeller Republican, presumably.
Presumably, yes.
I'm not sure. But anyway, so you wouldn't have pegged it. Anyway, that was a digression. The point was that, I mean, the only point is that, like, once as the Republican Party starts to have a certain character, candidates kind of have to get with the picture. I mean, that's your demographic, that's your constituency. And so even these people like first Bush and to some extent Reagan, who you wouldn't really, by virtue of background, figure them as, and Trump, fitting in every respect, they mostly wind up singing from the hymn book, right?
Well, I mean, George H.W., I mean, they have to make him. They're like, you have to call these leaders and make them feel like you care. And they're kind of, you got to touch base with them.
The Southern Baptists in particular?
Yes, and Falwell and some of those kind of, the ones that are really, prominent at the time. Mm-hmm. And they're big donors too. That's the other thing. And they start passing out voter guides and they start, doing Justice Sunday. We're going to preach about the Supreme Court. It kind of becomes, once politicized and once the organization has kind of purged moderates and you get a real Christian subculture with the television stations and kind of books and radio and all of that, and you kind of get this mass culture, it's like perfectly ripe to drive voters to the polls. I mean, it's got everything that you need, from a culture of giving, tithing, to you got everybody in one place on a Sunday, to all of that. You've got all that structure that you need. And so, Republicans, kind of begrudgingly, and then Dole, I mean, they have to make Dole go, I mean, he just does not want to kowtow to him. He thinks it's going to be it's going to really hurt the party. Right? He thinks it's going to really hurt the party. It's going to hamstring them. And especially as some of the ideas get more extreme. Then Bill Clinton, of course, wins some Southern states back for Democrats. Mm-hmm. And the numbers start even trending that he could be pulling back some religious voters, believe it or not. And he, again, Southern Baptist, but so the Republicans in 2000 double down. Karl Rove, helps get, gay marriage amendments on the ballots, right? In states, driving people to the polls, really does outreach to religious voters, pushes.
Wait, did you say Karl Rove helps get?
Karl Rove, during the George W. Bush's, 2 elections, one of the strategies they have is to put ban on gay marriage amendments on state ballots. To drive people to the polls that may be disillusioned with politics or maybe kind of non-voters, where they're going to go if that's on the ballot, right? And really play up, which for George W. Bush, it was very authentic. It had been very much a part of his, adult life that he had kind of converted and was religious. It was very much kind of a gospel of prosperity, gospel of wealth, kind of version. Mm-hmm. But he takes it to a whole other level by really kind of post 9/11 framing it as kind of a Christian nationalist kind of debate, making our foreign policy kind of sound like that, right? Mm-hmm. And funding the faith-based initiatives, with federal money, all of that. And so now what happens is the Republican Party at these forks in the road has gone right on all of these things. And the American people, to win these Southern voters, who they need, and the American people have kind of sorted themselves accordingly over time, right? But it takes a long time. So many white Southerners have flipped Republican, and then you've pulled some from other places too, and other former Republicans have abandoned, right? And so now what you have is, in 2016, if you look at Trump's white vote, if you are express this like racial resentment, or you express this modern sexism, or you express this other kind of Christian nationalism, it accounts for 95% of his white vote. Those three things. And they're not all the same people. Most people are one of three or two of three. Very few people are all three. That's Democrats like to portray it that way, which really offends people and doesn't help, right? When they lump everybody together as racist and sexist and, just evangelical. And that doesn't help because it's actually not true. It takes all three components, right, to get those kinds of numbers.
Let me ask you a question about Billy Graham, just tangentially. I have a special interest in this. We were Southern Baptists. My mother was a big Billy Graham fan. You note that the Republicans courted him. And of course, on the other hand, so did he. He was not averse to going to the White House for a Democratic president either.
Sure.
But in a way, he doesn't totally fit the profile to me. I mean, I came across a picture of him. I mean, maybe my view of him is warped because he was presented to me when I was a kid as such a wonderful person. But I came across a picture of him in the 50s. He made a point. It was clearly a posed photo of posing at like a soda fountain with some black kids. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now that's a pretty progressive thing for a Southerner to do in the 50s. He did it while visiting New York, I think, but still, it was a very self-conscious, it was a very intentional thing to do. That was where he wanted to stand on the issue. Is it a mistake to see him as to hang on to some
no.
positive?
Billy Graham was always making himself available as a spiritual kind of advisor to any leadership president, regardless of party.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. And I don't think he was used in any kind of way that had to do with a racialized component. But Nixon, when Nixon's hurting, when his numbers are bad about Vietnam, he needs to get in front of a lot of young people and have the optics of a big rally with a lot of young people thinking he's okay. Mm-hmm. And he shows up at Billy Graham's big revival he's going to have at the University of Tennessee in Neyland Stadium. Mm-hmm. And it's, this is the first thing that's ever been held at that stadium other than a football game. And it's full. And he gets Graham to pray over him, kind of endorse him in that way. And I think some of those Republican presidents, particularly Nixon, took advantage of Graham's, availability to be guidance for presidents. And I don't think that's necessarily a criticism of Graham. I just think that, I think it got exploitive. I think you see it now with the Trump, not of course with Graham, with the evangelical leader. I mean, and Franklin Graham's a far different story than his father. Right?
I find it harder to.
But he's a perfect example of where that stuff went from like father to son. It's an
interesting transition. I mean, but there are of course dark sides to Billy Graham himself that have been covered, but with Franklin, it's hard to see the light. I mean, just deeply Islamophobic. And it's funny. They asked Billy Graham once about Franklin. And he kind of did a little, he kind of said, well, he's his own, he kind of did not want to identify himself with the.
Some of it's where if you're going to marry the party and your, particular brand of kind of religious faith, then it's gonna go in a lot of really weird places that are not good, which is why a lot of Baptist ministers and why a lot of evangelicals in the 1950s and 40s were saying politics is a worldly concern and it is not your focus. Mm-hmm. And they were very much kind of hands off and saying the church does not get involved with that. Like that is you're an earthly concern and we're focused on your salvation and all of that, and your spiritual journey. It was very, very, very different, right? Very much a separation. And you can see polling on that. Even in the South, the samples are small because the South's always undersampled, but in national polls of people saying there should definitely be a separation of church and state, right? They really feel that. And then it really changes. And so now what's happened is, and the mistake we keep saying as kind of a country, I think, and it's a mistake Democrats make, is they say, well, these religious voters in the South, the evangelicals are the group that will not, has given Trump his highest approval ratings and kind of seems to be the one group not slipping, right? Why is that? And, but these are moral voters. They should be outraged. But the thing is they're just like any other voters. They have their political interest. They are a political interest group. So they abandoned the idea that their candidate would be like them. And now they just want a candidate or a president who will do what they want them to do, which is like what every lobbying firm, every interest group looks for. And if it comes in a package that seems to very much betray their values, but it does the actions that they want it to do, that they want that person to do, they won't betray it. So if you look at what percentage of Southern white fundamentalists and evangelicals call Trump a Christian, it's like in the 40%. But almost, 80, high 80s vote for him. And we think, we go, why is it they won't vote for him? But they will if he'll do what he says, just like every other political group and what they want. Right.
Okay. So, he is such an interesting, first of all, he's another example of somebody a president you would not have seen as entirely fitting the modern Republican profile. In some respects, yes, but like you wouldn't have thought he's going to, crusade against abortion, God knows. And
he's going to defend Robert E. Lee statues. I'm just like a really. New York guy.
I will say, of course, he did famously take out a full-page ad asking, I think, for the death penalty for the Central Park Five or something. So he was that kind of
birtherism and all that. Yeah,
coded use of law and order. What predates his presidency, but there's a lot about him that doesn't fit the mold. But anyway, he's pretty much accommodated himself to the template. And one question I have is, could he have done otherwise? After he was elected, it wasn't, certainly early in his candidacy, it wasn't clear exactly what kind of candidate he would be. Just to take one example, Steve Bannon wanted him to tax the rich very heavily and use it to build infrastructure or something. And that would have had implications for what his constituency could be going forward. He would have lost some rich people and would have presumably, I think Bannon's idea was, but you make up for that with lower income people coming from the Democratic Party. And so anyway, that's an example of how Trump might have been a little different. In your view, could he have started some kind of party realignment or something? Could he, or was all of this pretty much, in the cards in the end? He's running.
I'll tell you honestly, I started this book before Trump. Wrote the proposal for this book before there was a Trump, because the Long Southern Strategy was already there. And what I thought pre-Trump was that it had kind of created a Frankenstein party, in a sense that it had taken these turns to kind of win this group, and it was going to now reflect the views of such a small, narrow population. It was going to cede its majority, right? And so it had kind of backed itself into a corner, right? Which, when Obama wins in 2008, 2012, he wins some southern states, but he doesn't even need them, it's like he can win without it. He didn't have to crack any of them. He has enough electoral votes. And so you start saying, the Republicans pursue this strategy and back themselves into a corner, right? And I remember seeing that many people running for the Republican nomination. And I thought when there was that crowded of a field, the person who plays hard on race and gender roles and, evangelical Christianity or Christian nationalism, the person that goes to the far right on that, and then the southern states all put their primaries on the same day, the SEC primary. And a lot of the Republican primaries are a lot more winner take all than proportional, not all of them, but much more so than the Democrats. And you got to field of 20-something people running. The person that goes over there is going to gain that momentum. They're going to win South Carolina early on, and then they're going to win those SEC primaries. And I remember talking to some reporter, CNN or something, and saying, they said, oh, who do you think is going to win in the South? And I said, it's going to be Trump. And they just thought I was crazy. They thought it was going to be Ted Cruz. I was just crazy. But you could see him hitting those three things. Now, if everyone else, if all the other Republican candidates had dropped out and gotten behind one person, got behind a Kasich, got behind a Rubio, poured the money into it, can you beat Trump in the primary? You can, mathematically, but not when it's divvied up by all of these little bitty kind of.
But wasn't it Ted Cruz hitting all the same buttons?
But Ted Cruz's last name is Cruz.
Plus he's a jerk.
There is that, but he does. I mean, he got when you look at pockets that are what I would call creedal Christians. Yeah. So it is very purely theological. It is not kind of this social Christian that is, the church is the biggest institution in the small town. Everything happens at the church. Everybody belongs. And it's, whether you believe a lot or not believe a lot or even know a lot. Yeah. But these creedal Christians that are really devoted, that really know, and are in those kind of communities, they voted for Ted Cruz in the primary. Now they voted for Trump in the, general, but they voted for Cruz in the primary. But there's just not enough of them. Mm-hmm. But, okay. And his last name is Cruz, which when you have been, pushing back about Latinos, which is also, by the way, another fork in the road that, and to me, the one that's just devastating is for the party long term, unless there's a change on it, is, even George W. and then Rubio early on, they were talking about some kind of immigration reform, Republican-led immigration reform. And to build off of their Catholic, the religious ties with Latinos. And I remember, Latinos, which way they were going to go kind of partisan wise, or if they would, is a big issue, and now they're leaning so far Democrat because of Trump's policies. And that, unless the Republicans do something to pull some of that back, is going to be a huge detriment, demographically to that party. And I thought it was kind of already going that direction with the choices the Republican Party had made, except for the fact that a woman got nominated. That was definitely identified as a feminist woman who's got 40 years of negative publicity and history and political mistakes and, all of that baggage following 8 years of Obama.
I think she also inherited some animus from Bill.
Absolutely.
Three of my siblings voted for Trump, and in at least one case, there was anti-Hillary sentiment that I think actually had more to do with Bill than with Hillary. It was what they both seemed to represent.
It's what they both seem to represent. It's coming after Obama and 8 years and piggybacking on racial resentment. But when we look at controlling for all of those things, the role that this kind of distrust of feminism, it's through the roof, particularly among white women in the South. I mean, it's through the roof on her.
Do you think feminists and any prominent feminists could have done a better job of guarding against that? I mean,
I do. I think that it's subtle. I mean, Obama, for example, the racial resentment, attitudes, 30% of people who hold those attitudes still voted for Obama, of whites, 30% of white. And it's because somehow, even though they hold that, they disassociate him from it. They don't apply it to him, right? they might see him as an exception, or there's something else they like about him that kind of counters it, but usually they somehow put him in a separate category. And that has to be very deliberately and carefully done. And it has to be, and we have known that because we know about the Bradley effect, like the people who should vote, policy-wise for candidate A, but because candidate A is African-American, in the privacy of the voting booth, they won't. And like what percentage of people that is. We knew that going into Obama. Political scientists debate, is it 1 point? Is it 5 points? Like, where's the handicap? And they settle on like 3, and then Obama's team is going, we have to overperform, and we have to, in these places. We didn't do it for this modern sexism. We didn't look at this kind of resentment that is ushered in. It's all, is she tough? Can she be commander in chief? Right? And that is important, but there's something that comes after. So now that we know that, like, for example, Elizabeth Warren's numbers tend to be, or at least popularity, maybe depending on what you look at, kind of picking up a little bit. And it's when she started pushing the kind of, I'm the school teacher that you had that, was super tough on you because I care about you, but I'm kind of a geek and I've got a binder plan. And that trope is something we're a little more comfortable with. It's familiar, and it just shaves off just enough to maybe not usher such a strong reaction, right?
So speaking of Elizabeth Warren, who do you think of the Democratic presidential candidates? Who do you think has the best chance of beating Trump?
I mean, who I think has the best chance is not necessarily. I mean, personally,
not to get the nomination, and not assuming leave that aside. The question of who's best poised to get the nomination, or maybe a couple of people that you think are. I mean, for my money, honestly, it's a weak field in that respect. But even though there's a number of them I'd be happy to have as president, I don't think any of them, seem tailor-made to match up well against Trump in a way.
They don't. I mean, but it's like, again, it's the map, right? So that's the key, is the map, because any of them are going to win California, any of them are going to win New York. It's where, and it's knowing what really happened in those states that were purple. And there's a competing argument. One is, okay, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. This is, there's high modern sexism levels in all 3 of those states. She rubbed the wrong way. I don't find the economic argument in the data, but no data is perfect. So, worth thinking about too. But also, who's exciting, because the protest vote in 2016, the number of states in which there is a greater number of people that voted third party than the margin between the 2 candidates is 13 states, 155 electoral votes, 155. Now, we don't know if the protest vote, and if someone genuinely loved Jill Stein, I'm sorry to call theirs a protest vote, but third party vote, we don't know if it was people who didn't want to vote for Trump, right? Republicans didn't vote for Trump, or Democrats didn't want to vote for Hillary, right? Or independents that didn't want to vote for either. We don't know that. But it's that many people. It's way closer than 2000, way closer. I mean, it's not anywhere near 2000. And so,
although in 2000, Florida alone would have done it.
Totally. But the number of states and the number of electoral votes that a third party thing could have influenced is way smaller in 2000 than it is in 2016. And so that, to me, so I have the argument of kind of the modern sexism or the distrust of feminism really kind of threw Clinton off in some places that were important and makes me concerned. And I also have if it's the same old thing and there's not some excitement about the candidate, then that's problematic, right?
Right.
Based on that, if you'd asked me earlier this summer, I would have probably said, among the women, I still think Warren has the best chance. But I worry about the Medicare for all and that being very, very, very difficult to sell. And people don't distinguish well between campaigning and governing because the chances of getting that.
Right. They're not going to get it through Congress.
They're not going to get it.
The Republicans are going to kill them on the idea that they will force you to abandon health insurance you're happy with. That's just almost
the argument that nobody's happy with their health insurance. It's just a hard one to campaign on. If you start seeing her, she started dialing back on government daycare. When I heard that one in the very beginning, I was like, oh, Lord, shades of Phyllis Schlafly, right? Here we go. She kind of backpedaled on that. If she pushes that hard, now, maybe in a primary to get Bernie's voters and then she backtracks, possible. But Biden, a couple months ago, before a lot of the gaffes and stuff, I would have probably told you a Biden Abrams ticket is a really polls well in the really close kind of purple states. But Biden is struggling with a lot of answers.
And it's not shocking. It's not shocking with a person his age. It's not like it's abnormal necessarily, but I just realized the other day he's less articulate and coherent than Trump. I mean it.
He really seems to be struggling, particularly over the last couple months with the spotlight on it and keeping up this pace. I absolutely see that. Now, in terms of talent, I think Buttigieg is an incredible talent. I'd like to see him pick up steam. I don't think his career's anywhere near over. I think he's an important voice, mostly because he breaks up some of this polarization. He brings religion, military, all these things kind of together in ways that I think are helpful.
Although, are there religious pro-military voters who will have trouble with a gay candidate is an open question.
Yeah, there probably are, but there also, the Democratic Party needs to make some room for religious voters, in my opinion, and I think that's kind of.
You mean, yeah, okay.
In a sense, like, I don't know if that's going to bring a bunch of religious, evangelical Republicans over, but, it's something the party could embrace a little bit more. There's a lot of people that are some kind of spiritual life, whether it's non-denominational or what, that just the party is so this on. And, that's a very different thing than the evangelical fundamentalist Jerry Falwell thing,
Yeah.
I think Kamala Harris is so talented.
And yet more somewhere between that and Marianne Williamson on the spectrum of spirituality. So you think Elizabeth Warren has a better chance than Kamala Harris, sounds like. You said of the women. Are there...
I love Kamala Harris, though. She just doesn't seem to be picking up steam enough.
Yeah.
And we don't need to win California. Democrats, that's an issue.
So any other thoughts on that?
It'll be really interesting about Bernie because, Bernie has moved the party to me in really important ways. He really has. Mm-hmm. And he galvanizes a group that's needed there. Elizabeth Warren seems to be, and again, it's so early, but Elizabeth Warren seems to be kind of taking a little bit of his steam away. Mm-hmm. I don't know what happens. Those two are such, seem to be such, respectful of each other. I don't know what happens if they really start to be head to head, and kind of where people go. A lot of Bernie supporters, when they're polled, at least in Iowa, which how many Bernie supporters are there in Iowa? I don't know. But when they're polled in Iowa, they say their second choice is Biden. I don't know.
That's surprising.
But I don't think they're going. It's a group that's got to be. The Bernie supporters are something that every single Democrat candidate's got to take very seriously. Yeah. And if it's not Bernie, or it could be that, it's like the Trump thing. It's like everybody else kind of, is so close on things, right? that Bernie's, 20 something % starts to pick up. And then all of a sudden, that's enough if everybody else is 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, you know what I mean?
Yeah, although Elizabeth Warren is not all, she may be what keeps that from happening.
She might. And
so it sounds like you don't see, there's nobody you see as just the Trump killer. I mean, a lot of them could win. I mean, he's in so many ways a weak candidate, but you don't see somebody that looks tailor-made to do the job.
I don't see the perfect moderate.
Yeah.
Not moderate. That's the wrong word. I'm sorry. I don't see the perfect middle between kind of moderate, and AOC. I don't see kind of the perfect balance that I think the party needs. Mm-hmm. I don't. And I think that, and what I just hope is that, I wrote this piece a few weeks ago about our kind of the tragic irony of our political assumptions. And that is, I just couldn't help thinking about how much of what happened in 2016 was based on what we assumed. We assumed Hillary Clinton was going to win. We just assumed it. And we assumed it so much, some of us, like some people didn't vote. We assumed it and people were like, well, I don't like her, but some vote in third party. That totally they're right. But she's going to win. I just kind of don't want to endorse it. I get that. I think Comey, assumed she'd win. And it's like, I don't want to be caught not having put out information.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
I think the counterintelligence, investigation into Trump that, was being discussed, it seems like such a bold and radical move. And Lord, if somebody gets wind of it, it's such a mess. And you know what? He's not going to win. So, Putin may be trying, but he's not going to win. Right. So like, how far do we push that? All those things, and yet no woman's ever won. No woman's ever even been the nominee, but we assume, she's going to win. And then some decisions get made that kind of assume her right out of office. And now 4 years later, we're going, can a woman win? 4 years ago, we assumed that she would, So I have to check that in myself, of feeling like.
I think it's an open question. I think whenever a barrier hasn't been broken, it remains an open question.
Yeah, it does remain an open question. I mean, and the fact that so many people would vote for someone, the Access Hollywood tape should have been disqualifying. I mean, this is a party that picked John McCain 10 years ago. This is not that party, that standard is so low now. And why it's being tolerated and stuff, that's a whole other discussion. And I'm sure I'm not privy to all of that, but, that enough people would go in that, vein. I mean, it's unsettling to women. I'm trying to just say, fight for who you believe in the primary, fight hard, but don't get so attached that you can't cross over in the general, because no one candidate's going to solve this. No one candidate's going to fix everything. Yeah. It was a long strategy to kind of get us here. It's going to take a while to get it back, and you can't quit pushing no matter who's in the office. I mean, look how fast they got Biden to flip on the Hyde Amendment. I mean, and that to me will be the legacy, particularly if he doesn't get the nomination, and he might, of a lot of Bernie supporters is the needle they've moved. I mean, they're the power, not him. That's always the case for kind of.
You mean Bernie's supporters are the power?
I mean, the power isn't just Bernie. It's that they want change within the party. They want new things on the table that, centrists have said about. They bring new ideas. They bring real diversity. I mean, all of that.
And they bring energy. If your strategy is a turnout strategy, that matters.
Absolutely. And that is transferable from Bernie onto other people or candidate in 2020, because that's their power. It's not his, he might have sparked it, but you know,
and it's their decision. It's their decision whether Elizabeth Warren, say, can benefit from it.
That's right.
If she's the nominee. I mean, that's of course a delicate matter. Well,
yeah, but I do hope that, like, you know, I had this was like, I mean, a lesson I learned the hard way, but in 2008, I was, you know, I mean, I liked Obama. I didn't know much about him, but I was, you know, very upset when Hillary Clinton didn't get the nomination. I was a big fan. And one of my colleagues in the office, one of my, you know, closest colleagues, African-American woman specializing in African-American politics. And I came in, I was like, yeah, you know, I mean, I like him. Of course, I'm going to vote for him, but, you know, and she said, so it's not my first choice. She goes, you know, it's never African-American women's first choice. Never. And we show up anyway, meaning is Doug Jones their dream candidate in Alabama, you know, for Senate, but they show up anyway for kind of the collective good. And I thought, yeah, she's like, you know, you think Dukakis was our first choice? Do you think, you know, this? And she was being humorous, and she was, but, you know, it did remind me that, like, you know, in 20 something candidates, like, your first choice, the chances are slim, you know, they are. And in your lifetime, the chances are slim. More people are running, you know, and fight like hell for it, you know, but, you know, there's people relying on, you know, us of all walks of life to, you know, kind of stop the madness, you know, worldwide with this. And I hope Republicans do the same thing, because the problem has been throughout this long Southern strategy is that the candidates who wouldn't play it, who didn't, you know, work with the Manaforts and the Roger Ailes and these kind of these consultants that push this strategy, it's not always necessarily the reason they lost. There are other factors, but like talent and, you know, the political timing, all of that. But it reinforces it when the ones who play the strategy win. Mm-hmm. And if Trump wins again, it's like the people in the Republican Party going, oh my God, this is not my part. Like, upset, like kind of hoping it will pass, hoping it will, you know, the John McCain Republicans kind of hoping the party will find its way back. It absolutely won't if he wins again. It will absolutely send a message, this is the way you do it. And that's what I just hate to see. You know, I was really hoping there'd be a primary challenger of substance, you know, that could gain some traction, because the message needs to be, this is not, you know, this has gone way too far and is not acceptable. But it won't be if he wins again. And I worry about that.
Well, we'll see. Your book is a good way to frame the question. So it's The Long Southern Strategy, How Chasing White Voters in the South Changed American Politics. Todd Shields is your co-author, and you're Angie Maxwell. Now, are you, where else can people find you on the web? Are you on Twitter or anything?
I am. I'm on Twitter. It's at Angie Maxwell 1. And then I have a new website. It's not perfect. It's just kind of a gathering place for everything. It's called masonjarpolitics.com.
Okay. And I on Twitter, not that anyone asked, but am at Robert Writer, WRIGHTER. Thanks so much for taking the time, and congratulations on the book. And, you know, I guess we'll wait and see about whether the Southern strategy, the long Southern strategy, remains viable. But I'm on the edge of my seat.
We got months to go.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'll make it.
15 months to go.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, thanks so much,
Bob. I appreciate it.
Okay, bye-bye.